Sorry for the slightly delayed start. We had a couple of technical issues, but hopefully we can make up the time. So you all have joined as attendees, which means that you will be muted throughout this. So you won't be able to ask any questions verbally, but please feel free to use the chat box, not the Q&A box, because we've had some technical issues with that. Please use the chat box, and if you want to send it to me, the presenter, you can send any questions you have throughout this webinar, and then we can take a look at the questions at the end. Hopefully this webinar should run for about 45 minutes, which gives us plenty of time, hopefully, to take in those questions. Any questions that I can't get to, I'll be more than happy to take offline, and I can respond to you via email. Let's get started. As I said, welcome along. This webinar is focusing on using data visualization, best practices, and giving you guys some tips and tricks on how to implement these within your BI environment and with your solutions going forward. Hopefully, the idea is to give you a good starting point to maybe look at what you're providing at the minute to your users. And the idea is then to evaluate, are users consuming your reports and your dashboards in the best way? Can you maybe deliver better insights to them? And then can you also maybe get them either re-engaged with their business intelligence or even get them more engaged in what you're already working with? So a little bit more detail about what we're covering. So look at 5 areas in particular. First we're going to look at is, are we stuck in the 90s? And whenever I ask this question, it's not just about, the tools we're using. I know some of you may be still stuck using the earlier versions, like version 5 of Business Objects, or maybe even XIR 2.1. But it's not just looking at that, but it's also looking at the actual reports and dashboards that we're delivering. Are those designed for the current day user, or maybe are those designed for users of 10, 15 years ago? Because the way in which users these days now expect to consume their data is quite different. The functionality they expect and also the performance which they expect has changed a lot. And so we need to keep up to date with that. And even if we're using the older tools, it doesn't mean that we still can't provide them with a much more contemporary look and feel to the data that they're using. How users consume their data. But as I've mentioned, this has changed due to just the volume of data available to users in sort of today's environment, industry, on your smartphone, everything. It means that we're much more impatient in the way we consume data. So we're not really willing to take the time to evaluate and look at a 30 by 30 table to find that one number that we need to make that decision. Instead, what users want to see is that number on screen by itself in the center, just so that they can see it, understand it, and use it to then go forward and make a decision with. We're plugged in 24/7, which we want data yesterday, and then the way in which we deliver the data to them can have great impact on their confidence and trust in the data that we provide. Impact of design. So I hope you've joined this webinar because you do realise that design can actually have a great impact on the business going forward and on the strategy that they choose, because it can help others to explore their data more and to really understand it if it's clearly and simply put to them. So in this section in particular, we're going to then look at some aspects of design that we can focus on to help them to this decision. So this isn't going to be a one-stop shop for graphic designers. This is more maybe sort of 5 or 6 that you can then implement in your solution to help redesign and help the users re-engage with what they're trying to tell them. Our process, I've said our process, but this is a process that I use whenever I'm doing design work. And so it's just going to run through a 6-step process. We'll hopefully, at each step, we'll deliver a stronger piece of design. So each step is there to help really understand what the user wants, understand the data that they need, focus again on what's happening in the business and how to deliver that data, then looking at sketching it out and designing it, then looking at developing it, and then lastly, the most favourite of all, the UAT process. And we're going to touch on tools. So in particular, I'm going to be looking at the tools available in 4.1. I'm going to be saying briefly about the roadmap of those tools and then how we can best use those. Before 5, I wanted them to ask, when we say data visualization, what do we really mean? So one is that it is the visual analysis and communication of business data. Whenever, in this context, obviously, we mean the provision of analytics. The provision of analytics, not just a static number, but the enhancement of that number with supporting data to then help the user make that decision. And then we can analytics, and how do we then communicate that data? So we can come up with a fantastic statistical model that we can forecast the next 6 months of sales very accurately, and then we can provide it in a massive table showing each stage of the calculation, and your average business user, unless they have a master's in mathematics, actually find it very difficult to understand what the understanding is from that wonderful piece of analysis. So, and how to represent and present that data so that it exploits the user's visual perceptions and actually then amplifies their cognition of that data. To exploit their visual perceptions is to make simple, clear, and quick to understand. I said, because of the sheer amount of data that's around in the market at the minute, and it's not just business intelligence that's using data visualization, obviously. You've got marketing companies, you've got apps on your phones. We're getting bombarded by data visualization from all sides. And for this, the brain has created shortcuts for simply and quickly understanding that. So, as a developer in business intelligence, we should really use those shortcuts and hopefully present the data to our users is the simplest, and using those cuts to make it as clear and amplify their understanding as much as possible. So throughout this webinar, I'll be mentioning some of those shortcuts and what we can actually then do to get as quick and as easy for users to understand their data. So the purpose of visualization should be insight, not just pretty pictures. So yeah, we can't get caught up in making it as colourful and as wonderful as possible. At the end of the day, the insight, as I said, is just one figure, center a page, and what I need with maybe an indicator for growth and how that figure compares to last year. Then that's all we should provide them. We shouldn't necessarily provide them every single bell and whistle that the tool do because of the increase in functionality. So you always bear in mind that we need to be clear in the message that we're providing them. Back in the 90s, an excellent question. Users, as I said, are fed data. It's all highly visible, it's all highly visual, it's all access. And because of this, they've got a high degree of interactivity now with their data. They've got it very clearly displayed. They've got the simplicity of how it's now. All of the extras are stripped away. And these days, generally, most industries look to provide a very stripped back view of visualizing data. So this rewires then the expectations of the user and how they want to see not everyday data, but more importantly, data that will actually impact day-to-day business decisions. They'll want you to look at maybe some of the latest graphs and what those can provide. The weather and how it, in comparison, can then highlight key trends and then help them refocus in this instance. We've got the Women's England team from the last World Cup, and it shows how they performed in regards to shots on goal. Maybe this will help them redesign their training program, and it simply uses red then to highlight what the goals that they actually made, where they were made from. It's a massive trend at the minute, obviously. We're seeing them everywhere, especially in media. This is a really useful tool to tell a story in a visual way that often engages the user because they're interested, because they see the images. It is them quickly and allows them to really explore and dig in and find those little bits of information then that interest them. There's only an upward trend in mapping patterns and trends on maps. It's understanding when is a good time to use this, is the best way of using this. Yeah, being one of them, seemingly. But what we're seeing is that there is a trend for quite flat reporting, and it's often historical within business intelligence industry. A lot of the clients that I work with, this is something, a key concern with them, especially within the last couple of years, where they're looking at their reporting that they're doing. They're seeing that generally it's maybe not interactive, it's not very dynamic, and so they're getting a lot of feedback because of the shift in trends in how users are consuming the data. They're questioning, the user asking the question of the developers, well, why can't we get a similar look and feel, a user experience in our business data? Is it the tool? And hopefully by the end of this, we'll see it's not necessarily the tool, but it's maybe how we approach our design that can then provide them with what we've seen previously, which was a much more graphic way and visual way of representing their data. So I've got this work that we've done that use web intelligence. So the first two are web intelligence, and the last one obviously is mobile. But we're able to deliver, you not necessarily, I mean, this is all done in 4.1, but just, again, a design tips and tricks to help the brain assimilate quite quickly the information and not overwhelm it with, just tables of data and things like this. Okay. Next, we're going to be asking, how do users consume their data? We talked about some things. We talked about the rewiring of the brain and the fact that now shortcuts are being developed. Our brain sees things and automatically draws conclusions. And can we as BI developers take advantage of this? Good design exploits the seeing and decreases the amount of thinking a user has to do. That at the core is the fundamental thing. So the eye takes in the data and it gets sent to the visual cortex and the brain sees it. The faster that we can understand and process that data, better. The longer it takes sitting in the cerebral cortex, think data, the more disengaged the user is going to get, the less likely they are to reuse that report, the more likely they are to ask for a different report. So to try and work out what shorts we can take to make that process as quick and as seamless as possible. Other industries have already done our work for us. So especially in advertising, marketing, saying of different things, we've already got associations that we make. So happy face, you think, okay, happy thoughts. Emojis are now being replaced. So whenever people even communicate with each other, they replace words with images. Idea is, can we then utilize some of this to make what we're trying to communicate to our users as simple and as understandable as possible? We do remember, though, as Andy Kirk says, funky and fancy isn't important, but clear understanding is. Because we've got all these shortcuts available to us. If we don't use them correctly, they help rather than hinder the process. So if we don't design our vision with the user that is going to use that visualization in mind, then we may incorrectly use those shortcuts. And so we may actually create a report or a dashboard or even a whole report pack which is designed for the wrong person, and so won't actually utilize the right shortcuts, and they'll actually spend more time thinking about it, trying to work it out, that we had designed it for. Research has actually shown that while design is important, the confidence of the user in using and visualizing and understanding the design is as equally important. Because as I said, at the end of the day, we could very easily create a visualization that doesn't make sense to a user. Some of the areas that this relies on includes their familiarity with the data, extrapolate it, and to draw the information out of that data. In this case, his work actually mentions that there's approximately 75 different chart types that we could use if we wanted to whenever visualizing data. But average user, I'll admit quite freely myself as well, are not going to understand how to quickly extrapolate data from these 75 different chart types. At most, users will generally be able to understand quickly maybe 10 different types of charts. Really have to be careful that we overuse the new functionality available to us. And obviously, the level of confidence in the data and the level of confidence in the developer, so that they feel confident that whatever the developer provides them is going to be clear. All the filters are going to be very clear, so they know what data they're looking at. And it's actually shown that a user that is familiar with the layout and design of a report can more easily access the data within that report. So whenever you're thinking of designing a solution, what's often a good approach is to get a sort of a foundation look and feel, almost like a template, and reuse that, because when they see it, they understand immediately what they're looking at because they've seen a similar layout or they've seen a similar use of chart before. So this that I'm mentioning and the research that I talked about previously is that at the minute in the UK, there's a data project taking place, which is headed up by Professor Helen Kennedy at the University of Sheffield. And they're in the middle of doing research which, as I mentioned, focuses on the user rather than the data side of it, and the visualization side of it. And they have found, and as I said, it's only halfway through at the minute, but they find actually that emotions can be a factor affecting engagement and then change when users look at visualization. And obviously, asking you to go out and create sort of deeply emotional and profound reports that are going to change the world But it is something to consider whenever we look at what we're designing. Because emotions aren't just obviously happy and sad, but emotions can be used to drive action. So can we use something like maybe raising concern or alarm in a person to make aware of issues? Or can we use some sort of visualization technique to amplify satisfaction in what they're seeing or surprise in what they're seeing? And it's using those image colors to then to affect this emotion. But those emotions then will have a quick impact. It'll make the user curious, and it'll make them want to re-engage with the report to use it again. Okay. And then next we're going to look at is obviously then the impact of all this lovely design. So these images, these colors. And what do I mean whenever I talk about design? How to communicate the data, as I mentioned, is going to be very important. The anatomy of the report, the anatomy of the dashboard, how to set it up is going to influence obviously how it will be consumed. Now, these 7 areas in particular that I've highlighted that we should be aware of whenever we're designing a report. The report is going to make an impact so that it's clear, the readability of it is very straightforward. So obviously there are some text types that will create associations with things, either because, as I said, they're used in marketing. So some entertainment companies, for instance, will maybe use some more funky text because they maybe have attractions that are branded a certain way. And that's absolutely fine. I think it's more for the day-to-day operational reporting. You're obviously going to want to use text that are quite readable. Use of colour. It's quite an obvious one. You've got, your blue and pink for male and female. You've got your red and green and orange, obviously, if you want to look at creating awareness over alerters and things like that. But then also you do have the use of colour in regards to branding. So there will be a corporate palette potentially that you'll use, and it's how you use that to best effect, because whenever it's maybe it's sometimes that you choose a primary colour and then you use grayscale with that colour, and that can actually then highlight that or highlight an important or key message that you want to display in your report. So take a look at that in one more detail later. Size, obviously, the bigger, older, the more important. Emphasis. It can also then create a flow to the document. I can also then look at key information versus secondary information that surrounds it. So highlight the key information, but then also imply that the smaller information is just in support of that, rather than being the focus point of your report. So whenever we look at interactivity, we talk about maybe explanatory reports, which are very static because they're to explain the question, versus exploratory reports, which will look at much more interactivity. So we'll look at, for instance, in Webby, you can use prompts, you can use input controls, you can use report level filters. All of those provide that level of interactivity, which allow you to give not just that static view of the report, but actually a lot more information to the user if they want it. So I'm not just talking about the textual arrangement like you can see here, but I'm actually talking about the arrangement of components maybe within the dashboard or the different graphs and views within the report. Generally, the brain will consume data from left to right and from top to bottom. So you're going to put the key metric, the key message in the left-hand corner, and the eye will read them from left to right and going down the page. So any then secondary or supportive data will then flow in after that. That'll allow you to tell a story with the data, and will then hopefully help the user follow that story and so be able to follow the analytics that you're providing them and help them then get to the right point where they can make the decision that they need. You can do this with annotations. So annotations in particular are there just to provide insights, maybe a graph or a piece, a metric that's shown. It's there maybe just to supplement rather than having to create a secondary report that then have to navigate out to. You can maybe use an annotation just to give them a little bit of a deeper understanding of what the data set is trying to tell them. Saying that annotations can actually then busy up a dashboard or report. So you want to, be aware of how you're using them and use them wisely. Looking at position. Position gives a degree of importance. It's maybe quite similar to arrangement. It will allow you to then tell a story of the flow of data across the report or across the dashboard. So really, at the end of the day, we want to just make sure that we're understanding the representation and the presentation of the data and make sure that what we're trying to say is clear and simple, and that we're using these 7 design aspects then to communicate as effectively as possible. Okay. So I mentioned colour usage can actually be a very powerful one. Used in lots of different ways. It can be used, for instance, to evoke meaning. So in this case, I've got the example of male versus female, pink versus blue. And very quickly, in the pie chart, you can see you don't even need to look at the little icons underneath to understand pink, female. Okay, so females bought example of annotation as well. So females bought 33% more tickets than males. And that quickly cognized by the brain. To facilitate visual identity and to preserve visual salience. So whenever we talk about salience, we talk about it standing out relative to the background. Present data. We're looking at, you can use sequential, will allow you to show a degree of change from low to high. Diverging, obviously, so that will allow you to, again, show from low to high, but it'll give you then that critical midpoint, and it will show the degree of towards either the low point or the high point. Categorical, so if you're looking at something like a dimension, and you can actually then categorize each of those dimensions using color, and that means that it separates each of the mix and quickly to the eye. Aesthetics. There's no enhancing your aesthetics with some nice bright colours. You notice that whenever we talk about colour usage, if you are, say, unfortunate enough to have red in your corporate palette, you do have to be quite careful of where you use it. In this instance, we at Intelligence do have red in our corporate palette. And the official slide deck that I got had lots of red across it. So I've actually changed it. I've got past marketing. You'll see that things like the bullet points, the highlighted words, I've used blue rather than red because obviously red creates alarm. And I don't want to alarm anyone with data visualization. So it's just little things like that can often go a long way to just, engaging the user and getting them in the right frame of mind then to understand the data. Colour choices enhance and clarify, but if not used wisely, and if used slightly over-eagerly, they can also obscure, muddle, and confuse the user. As I said previously, a great tool is grayscale, showing a measure in comparison design. So, for instance, if you're showing on a chart a trend of this year's sales versus last year's sales, the information obviously is this year's sales. So you'll want to do that in a color, like for instance blue. But obviously you still want to show the trend of what was happening last year. And so a good option would be to then show that in grayscale rather than in the color. So it's still visible on the graph, but not dominating the graph. So it's the use of color in that way can actually then really enhance how the user views the data. Color wheel, and so if you're wanting to create high contrast, very visible mix, and then contrast it with the background. So for instance, if you wanted to get the user's attention, then you use the opposite side of the wheel. So in this case, if you wanted to have the metric in orange, you could then have a background of blue, which lifeboats are orange, and that would then be visible to the user, and they'd be able to see that very quickly and make a decision very quickly. Obviously, there's some things to be aware of. Our colour blindness. In Northern European ancestry, it does affect 8% of men. It affects 0.4% of women. So the likelihood is in your company there will be users who are colourblind. So options are, rather than using just green and red to highlight something, you can use symbols as well. So you can have a red triangle, a green square, and that then just allows anyone who needs the ability to differentiate between those two. And contrasting colours, there are some colours that shouldn't be contrasted, and those are some examples: black on blue, white on yellow, and then obviously for those with colour blindness, it's red on green. We have access to lots more functionality and more options with charting. But we have to be aware, and we do have to be wise about when and where we do use that, because what the functionality for 3D, and this example, 3D pie charts, is available. Assume that data, the actual data that's being represented on the screen right now, can often be very misleading. And for that is because a 2D pie chart will actually show you that each of the sections are equal, but due to the 3D quality of the pie chart, the grey area is significantly greater to the brain than the pink and the blue. So it's just being aware of little things like that when creating visualizations. So some functionality actually ends up hiding data rather than showing it. Just the structure of this chart, I've got no idea really. So again, being aware of, is the visualization actually hindering the message that you're trying to communicate because it's either hiding something or it's just not clearly comparison. And scale. So this deep drop in August, this is a much deeper drop across the year. And that doesn't look too bad. So it's just being aware of, whenever you put a graph on the page, that you're using the right area for the graph, that you're not actually sending the wrong message because of the way you sized it relative to other components on the page. Quite an example of this, and it is a bit of an old school, well, it's 2014, so actually not old school at all, but a good example of this is this chart. So if you just take a quick minute, have the chart and see if you can understand what I'm trying to tell you. So you use the axes, the data, and what the graph is actually showing you. And then when the x-axis is actually brought into scale, obviously look like quite rapid increase. Now quite a gradual increase up until 1820. So up until 1820, the rate was bad. Obviously, it went much more dynamic. What we're actually trying to show is the comparison of different countries. And with area graph, it's actually very difficult for the brain to do comparisons across the different points on the x-axis. So now, what a graph would something like a line graph, because that very easily shows the relational difference and comparison between the countries. So this example is there to show scale, use of graph, and the impact it can have on how the user engages with the data. Of those 7 things, then do we prioritize? When it comes to us visualizing the data, how do we prioritize what are the most important things? And what I've actually done is I've used this it shows, it prioritizes for a individual, and it's based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which he designed in 1954, and it shows a user, or for an individual, they need to be satisfied and fulfilled before they'll move on to the next level. So they, at a basic level, need food, water, etc., before they then move on, and they're filled and they're satisfied with that level. Then they move on to the safety, then they move on to loving and belonging, then they move on to to esteem, and then to the pinnacle, according to Maslow, which is self-actualization. So when we're addressing design, what hierarchy should we use? Is that at the core of whenever thinking about designing visualizations, first of all, we need to make them functional. Based on needs, provision of data to answer the user business question. Then developer, and the relationship that we've built with the user, we can then understand at what point they're satisfied. At that point, we can then move on to readability. So that it's performant in the context of the existing environment. I feel like, because I'm very aware, obviously, that some of you struggle performance, and it's just making sure that your visualization is performant within the environment that you're using it, and that, because you can't set unrealistic expectations. If a report generally takes X amount of time to run, then obviously through communication with your user, you'll be able to set their expectations about what they can expect. Satisfied with that level, you then can move on up to usability. So it's easy to use. Also, then at this level, it's of moderate importance. Right down at functionality, generally design, it's basic. But at level down, we can look at really designing in a way that then will capture the user. So at the point then, we really start to engage in how we can make it as impactful as possible. Satisfied, then we can look on to empowering the user with that data. And then we've got then the creativity side of it, so the aesthetic and the innovative. And once we're able then to get to that point, that's whenever we can look to really sort of take time to deliver the best design in the best way of communicating to the user. Obviously, at the core of it, it's accurate. What we're showing them has to be accurate. Whilst other industries might get away with being slightly more flexible with the types of data visualization they provide, we have to really take the time to understand what on the page, how we're showing it, the different importance. If prompts, if interactivity is used, we need to make sure that the user's then not going to filter the reports, run off, print it, and maybe go and create a strategic decision based on that, forgetting what they filtered it on whenever it's not actually represented on the page. So we make sure that the visualization is accurate in what it's the user because of the way in which the user is using it. And obviously then we need to make sure that the data is as accurate as possible as well. is a quick view of what David McCandless was the road to successful information design. So the components that were relevant were integrity, interestingness, functionality, and form. Using proof of concept, experimentation, sketching, and eye candy, you would then reach a successful design. Of expecting that is design for your audience and the data and keep it simple. So there's that, and distilling it down to those three things. Using those 7 aspects that we looked at the beginning, the color, relative size, position, arrangement, we can items and design for the user and actually represent the data. Keep it simple. Then we'll end up with a strong visualization that the user engages with and consume to then drive any decisions that they make. So the process that I come up with for doing this. So this, whenever either a POC comes in for us to take a look at, or we get sent out to look at requirements, I'll always bear this in mind as the process that I would use then going forward. So the step obviously then is to clearly define the business need. It could be that a user will send in a request, simple, very straightforward, very clear, and maybe it will only require a 5-minute conversation with them just to confirm that that is what they need. As long as I feel that communication though does need to happen, just so that that relationship is established at that first step, and that any misunderstandings or any further clarity that's needed happens at that stage, so that you don't end up going on to step 2, 4, 5, and 6, and knows that if you just asked one question at the beginning, it would have been a successful outcome, where now you've ended up with a report that took you a week to build that actually doesn't meet the needs. So it's a 5-minute conversation, or it can be as much as a workshop with multiple users in a room to then sit down and discuss, flesh out, and really define what the business need is. One up, you can then look at mapping out the data requirements and the gaps that you find. It could be, the data inside out, upside down. That's absolutely fine. It's still good to do a step, if you're using the new tools, just so that you can understand performance implications, and even just to jog your memory about maybe what dimensions are in there, what measures you could use, because this will actually then impact your design. So it could impact the type of colors you use or the images that you use to represent the data. Again, is to focus, again, on who it's for and how it will be consumed. And it doesn't have to be, again, this is maybe quite a quick step, but it's just giving you that chance to refocus. Now the data, now that you know the needs, you look at considering what type of design you want to look at, the functionality you're thinking of using, and even at this point you can sit down in a brainstorming session with other colleagues to come up with the best give data and the needs of the user. Brainstorming, then you can maybe design your visualization, the flow of it, how you interact with it. At this stage, I would say it should still be relatively tool agnostic, unless you've only got one tool to use. The tools that you design for should be immaterial. They should be thinking about what the user's needs are. I've got access to multiple tools that design without thinking of the tool set. At the end, once you've got your design, you can say, right, what tool does this fit? Is it, right, this is going to require a lot more of an exploratory view than Webby is able to. So maybe this is actually something like an explorer space, or looking for more of an infographic look. So maybe we'll use Lumira, or actually, no, this is just a static one-off report, in which case Webby is a good shout. You then develop the visualization. Often this is the step that most of us would jump to from one, and often maybe half-finished one. So we'll maybe quickly find out the business needs and we'll jump straight into development. We'll start dragging in variables and we'll start to create the visualization. And if you've missed out steps 2, 3, and 4, it can sometimes mean that you spend, as I said, time developing something that actually doesn't meet the needs of the business. And then of all, the UAT. So at this point, it's good to remember not to get too attached to your design. And what will happen is that you'll design something, you might get your feedback, and because you spend all this time from steps 1 to 5 designing it, and you're then quite reluctant to change it, but at the end of the day, you have to remember that the report is for the user. So this report is for the person consuming it. And if you've got any questions or concerns about the way it's visualized, then often the best process is actually to sit down to talk those through and to come up with then the best alternative, or maybe you can talk them around to your way of thinking. But as long as that interaction, that conversation happens, but if a user's brain is wired to enjoy good pie charts, then that's then the best visualization to give them. So I completed steps 1 to 6. I always say it's great to actually then evaluate it at the end. So you've gone through this process either by yourself, and it could be just for a minute or two, saying, right, that went well, I could have done that one better. And once through that 6-step process is to sit down and meet even with other users, so colleagues, if you want to get them in a room, if it was a particularly big piece of design work, then it's great to say, right, so this is what happened, this was the need, this is what my data was, I had this brainstorm session and then we came up with a design, this is what I've developed, I had some issues with this, this functionality I find really difficult to work out, but I finally did it, so I know how to do that now. And then this was how it went with UAT. We actually found out that they weren't quite happy with it, so we hadn't clearly captured maybe the business needs at the beginning. So next time, what we can do is we can look to change the way in which we maybe do step 1. And then you can develop a process that works for you and maybe your colleagues as well, of how to then get the best visualizations for your users. So yes, at the end of it all, you need to establish who it is for, what business insights pre-represented, and deliver it with accuracy, clarity, and simplicity. I mentioned this process is one that I've used myself. So we had an internal project looking at developing a solution. We all got in a room, we sat down with the whiteboard, and we started sketching out ideas. Then I was able to create a design. It's a great way of doing this. I sat down, I sketched out the design, and from this then I was able to identify functionality-wise if we were able to achieve the design, what issues there might be. But from the brainstorming session, we were extract and then be creative then within the design itself. Comes a half-finished dashboard. So from that design process, we then went into the development process, which is still ongoing, and then we'll go into the UAT process, which, as I said, is always the process. But that quick way of showing that 6-step process can be actually implemented. You can see there's quite a bit of white space, and that's not a bad thing. Space allows the brain to breathe. I didn't feel that unless the page is full, that it is not a successful data visualization. So always to leave room to breathe. So good. Another quick tip, as used in media, as I said, left to right, up to down, blocking things, lining things. The brain, you should confuse the brain by having things all slightly out of alignment, because the brain spends time trying to line things up that it would be spending actually working out what the data is telling them. So yeah, always take the time just to make sure everything's lined up. And about, at the beginning, we looked at interactivity, annotations, and sorting in particular. You should consider the deployed component on your dashboard or report. So it minimizes the thinking time and maximizes the interpretation of the data. Annotations wisely. So you can now set different components to appear and disappear, but you have to be careful, because when I to create comparison between two visualizations, the user doesn't create memory for things flashing in and out, so that comparison can be lost. And yes, we try to minimize the amount of different font types used, just because, as it says, it's not necessarily a ransom note. And the different types of sorting that you can utilize are relational, alphabetic, time, categorical, and hierarchical. So another quick example of a redesign is that I was sent this piece of work and I was asked, this is the information I want, I've quickly drawn this up, can you take a look? I came up with this. This is just, again, stripping it back, making it clear, using grayscale, and just with a few simple ways. I'm not changing necessarily what graphs are being used, but because the user that sent me this has an affinity for those graphs, but I'm changing the way in which they're laid out, and obviously the colours used, just to make the message a lot clearer. Simple steps, you can then change the way in which the user will engage with it. Right, I can see that we have a few minutes left, so I'll just run through quickly the tools. So type 1, you've got Webby, Webby Rich Client, and Crystal for your main reporting needs. For dashboards, you've got obviously dashboards, also known previously as Excelsius, and now you've also got Design Studio. Just to touch briefly on this, the roadmap is that these two will eventually merge. It's going to happen immediately, so there's still time. But it's just to be aware that going forward is something that SAP do have their sights set on. Interface or more exploratory tools, then you do have Explorer and Lumira. Again, these two tools are set in the future to merge. So just be aware, you will notice when looking at the tools, there is quite a bit of crossover in look and feel of the tool and the actual output that they produce. But with all of these tools, it is always good to keep on top of releases, any new functionality, in particular with the tools like Mira, which have had quite a quick development cycle. But it's also then useful not to think of these tools in the traditional way in which they've been used. Because you'll be quite surprised. Previously, whenever I showed you some of the reports that we've built, there were dashboard-looking reports that were built in Webby. So then keep the tools, whenever you're designing, don't think of the tool you're designing for, keep it very agnostic. Because often you will think maybe that dashboards is the way to go, but actually, because of the enriched charting functionality in Webby, in 0.1, Webby is actually the better tool to choose. And then some examples, again, the one that we saw previously. That's show what Webby, mobile, etc. is capable of. You can see it's highly visual. In this case, maybe it's doing some things in Webby that you wouldn't necessarily have it capable of. So using images to represent data, colours consistent. So anytime you see pink, it is female. See the blue, it is male. And I would say another for using colour is building a template is to be consistent in the colour that you assign a metric. So if you maybe have 4 or 5 key metrics within your company, assign it a colour and then keep that consistent across all reports, all dashboards, because you can then create shortcuts within your users. Whenever they see a metric represented in the colour, they won't even need to look at the title. Just know that that is sales revenue because it's blue. And then what you can, is an example of Crystal then. That's looking at university data using Crystal. So there's some resources that you can look at if you want to get some more information on this. There's some books, and then also some blogs available, and then some media sources available. If you, at the end of this, I'll be sending out a follow-up email, and I'll include on that a list of these resources. So if you're interested, you can go along and have a look maybe at Andy Cook's Visualizing Data website, or just keep a track of what the New York Times is doing in regards to the data visualizations that it provides. So that's everything for today. Just a quick click. And I don't see any questions, which I hope because that means that I've explained myself clearly. If, however, you do have any further questions, so for instance, once you take a look at maybe some of the resources that I can send out to you, do you have any questions, do feel free to contact me. Those are details. And also, this, you know, is a webinar set up by Intelligence, and we do have lots of other events. Feel free to go along and have a look at the other events that we're hosting. But as I said, I hope you enjoyed today's session. I hope it's given you some ideas maybe for what you can implement, and some ideas maybe for how you can re-engage your users. We do also run a workshop on this. If you're interested, just mail our team and we can take a look. We'll be running a workshop for this. Yes, thank you for attending, and I hope, as I said, that you find it useful.